when we publish something in the LeMay Center or across the Air Force, it is consumed, translated, and disseminated in China almost immediately.
As a reminder to listeners, all topics discussed are unclassified, and views expressed by guests or hosts are not necessarily the position of the United States Air Force or the Department of Defense.
Our topic for discussion today's podcast is Agile Combat Employment and China's reaction to the development of that doctrine. Our guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Justin Settles. Lieutenant Colonel Settles serves as a Deputy Director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute, also known as CASI. CASI's mission is to advance the understanding of the strategy, doctrine, operating concept, capabilities, personnel, training, and organization of China's aerospace forces and the civilian and commercial infrastructure that supports them. Lieutenant Colonel Settles is a China aerospace doctrine subject matter expert with 4 tours in the Indo-PACOM area. Sir, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, Switch, thank you very much for having me. This is excellent. I mean, this is what CASI is all about. It's doing research, education, across PME, but also across the Air Force, Space Force, Joint Force, to advise when we're trying to develop plans and strategy, and we're trying to assess the strategy and plans through exercises and war games. It's just any opportunity to talk about China and increase the sense of urgency among the force, and then to increase the level of understanding.
Well, thank you for being here. And it's fortuitous timing for all this. Just this week, the Air Force operationalized the ACE concept. So that was just signed here, June 23rd, by General Brown. Before that, obviously, as you know, the ACE Doctrine note was signed and published December of this past year. And then we here at the LeMay Center have been continuing to develop ACE Doctrine, and we're planning on re-releasing a new version of that ACE Doctrine note coming this summer. There's a lot to talk about, but really what I want to focus on is China's reaction to our development of Agile Combat Employment, and has there been a reaction to our development of Agile Combat Employment?
Well, what does Agile Combat Employment mean to you, as somebody who's been working it for a long time?
Well, the definition would be a proactive and reactive operational scheme maneuver executed within relevant threat timelines to generate combat air power. So that means, to me, being able to survive the offense that China or some other country would provide, while being able to react and then generate air power again. So whether that be small UAS, whether that be hypersonic, ballistic missiles, whatever threat they provide to our enduring locations primarily, but now our contingency locations as we disperse, it's to disperse away from our enduring locations to complicate the enemy's targeting scenario to be able to generate combat air power.
Well, it's the reason why I asked that is because I think it's important to continue to educate people about what ACE is for us as a concept, and then I'm struck because after I was medically grounded from flying, they made me a logistics guy, and as a logistics readiness officer dealing with kind of the deployment and sustainment process of forces forward, obviously ACE introduces a significant logistics challenge in trying to take the fixed basing that we have and move to ACC commander. You said 50 locations just in the Indo-PACOM AOR. And so I think about the shift from kind of expeditionary air forces and deploying and sustaining forces forward, where a lot of times we push to establish enterprise logistics, and then we were focused on individual units and their readiness to deploy to those places where we had already laid in a lot of enterprise logistics. And so I think about that, applying to the Chinese example. And then the second piece is about C2, and I think that there's an interesting linkage that is not always made on the linkage between ACE and Joint All-Domain Operations, and that idea of the C2 challenge is actually more similar than we give it credit for. That by the integration of operational capabilities across a geographic span has similar elements to integration of operational capabilities across domains. And it's something that, and some of the solutions are the same. And so that's the other piece when I think about China. And I think about it on the logistics side. I think about how they look at ACE in the United States, and I think about how they try to integrate across geography and deeper in kind of the domain stack in China.
So you bring up a great point with the discussion about logistics, and I'm going to pivot here a little bit, and I'll try to bring us back to this Agile Common Deployment discussion. Since you brought up logistics, obviously with Agile Common Deployment, we talk about a push logistics system versus a pull logistics system, and we've really worked hard on perfecting or working towards perfecting our logistics system in the global war on terror and developing new logistics methodologies in Agile Common Deployment and in the analysis therein. China hasn't fought a war since 1979. Do they realize the challenges there in logistics to be able to fight a war? And I ask that question because we're seeing the logistics system being challenged on the Russian offensive in Ukraine,
Right.
With the amount of trucks available, with the rail line differences, right? We're seeing all those logistic challenges. Has China looked at what's happening in Ukraine and reanalyzed their logistics system, and are they applying any of those lessons learned?
That's a great question. I think that the Chinese, is one metric that I always think is interesting, that in the PLA Air Force, the Chinese Air Force, not a single member of the Chinese Air Force has combat experience and is not fighting war since 1979. And I think their last surface-to-air missile engagement was in 1987, as kind of the most recent operational experience that they have in their force. That it is something that they recognize, but this is a Doctrine podcast. You're a Doctrine guy. The Chinese are reading our doctrine and that of our allies and partners and the Russians, trying to find the lessons learned. So they've seen the experiences with the first Gulf War in the 90s, seeing the way that we operated in Kosovo, then during that campaign, we bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Serbia, that the Chinese don't believe was an accident. So they look at that as not just how we were operating, but they believe that it was the United States trying to intentionally attack and target China. And so it created this sense of urgency 20 plus years ago to improve their systems, improve their training, improve their platforms, in order to try to respond in case they were in some sort of military engagement with us. So when we publish something in the LeMay Center or across the Air Force, it is consumed, translated, and disseminated in China almost immediately. And so they are tracking. They are tracking what we're doing because we're the best, and they know that we are the most powerful fighting force that's ever existed on the planet. And we've gone through lots of lessons learned during the Cold War, especially the last 2 decades of a lot of expeditionary operations that they are paying attention to. And then in the Ukraine example, I think it's not. I don't think it's a great example. People bring up the idea of a paper tiger, right?
I was actually going to go that direction after this. Yeah.
For China, but I think that the hollowing out of the Russian military you see as largely due, from my perspective, to corruption, and this idea of readiness they were pursuing specific metrics, but metrics that were not related to achieving success on the battlefield. And the Chinese system may have been more like that 20 years ago or 30 years ago, where actually military units in China had to generate some of the revenue for their own budgets. So it created this incentive, these perverse incentives to essentially be corrupt or to divert some of your focus and resources onto engaging in the economy, trying to generate revenue just to keep the lights on and to get things done. But today, the Chinese took those lessons, and especially from the Gulf War and from the war in Kosovo, that they needed to not be in the situation that Russia's in today. So they've spent the last 2 decades being more honest with themselves about their level of readiness. Still takes a long time. They're building from a low level of capability and a low level of readiness that today they are further along than the Russians, certainly. It's also just a very different situation because the Russians invading Ukraine, they're going outside of their established lines of communication and supply chains in order to invade someone else. And there's a different skill set that's required to do that. And in China, most of the conflict, if there's conflict around their periphery, the possibility of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, the Indian border, all those areas they may engage in military aggression, but they're using internal lines of communication, internal supply chains. Even in potential invasion of Taiwan, they are using lots of their own internal supply chains and lines of communication in order to support that operation, but they'd still have to cross the Taiwan Strait, conducting an invasion. That's where you're exponentially increasing the logistics challenges. But because of that, they've recognized that they have shortfalls, and they've been working to try to close those. So it's something that they probably started from a much lower level than the Russians did, but they've been more serious about identifying and correcting the readiness issues.
Really interesting, because you bring up the logistical challenges and the fact that they're reading our doctrine and have they mirrored any of our doctrine in application, specifically in joint planning, in logistics planning, and I know you often make the joke behind closed doors that all China has to do to encrypt their doctrine is write it in Chinese, and we don't have that culture to read their doctrine. So from somebody who's read a significant amount of their doctrine, do they mirror any of our doctrine in application? And then what specifically lessons have they taken away?
I think there are two sides of that. One is that when they read about ACE, and in particular, they are looking for opportunities to understand it and then potentially to exercise it. So actually trying to look at how you would support forces in more austere locations, trying to minimize the amount of personnel that would be required to support that and actually continue to enable operations. The other part of it that they are looking at is the threat that we see when we're looking at ACE as an operational concept. Is that how you phrase it, as an operational concept?
Operational scheme maneuver.
Operational scheme
concept,
maneuver,
absolutely.
as you describe it.
Yep.
As an operational scheme maneuver, we're looking at a comprehensive threat to our fixed basing, to our main operating bases, primarily in Asia, but anywhere, that our bases because we have used the economies of scale to garrison into places like Kadena and Yokota and Guam as these massive bases with lots of diverse capabilities. That's increased our level of vulnerability just by aggregating those forces. But the Chinese believe in some sort of military engagement, any sort of military engagement with the United States or our allies and partners, potential partners, that their bases will be vulnerable as well. So they're thinking through the same problem set, and then likely the fact that we're talking more about vulnerability and talking about schemes of maneuver, and they're saying, oh, well, we're seeing the same problem set. It's increasing the salience of the threat to them as they see our increased willingness to confront and to challenge their aggressive threats and rhetoric and actions. That they're willing to, that they're exploring those schemes of maneuver themselves, and then potentially using the same model or same kind of idea of a threat to fixed basing. Now they're exploring their own options for it. So we've seen an increase in them doing, kind of hopping between bases. Or hopping between pretty built-up commercial infrastructure, commercial airfields near their military airfields. In many ways, similar ways that we do day to day in the Air Force and the DoD. So the first layer of just kind of off-station operations for aviation, then the second of an expeditionary deploying a unit where you have more enterprise support, and then the third of actually looking at austere locations. But if you think about this, especially the density of airfields in southern China and eastern China, military airfields and commercial airfields, I actually look at their posture more like the way that the United States had our basing posture during the Strategic Air Command days during the Cold War, where we had bomber squadrons and tanker squadrons and fighter squadrons spread out over more bases in the United States. And so over time, we've aggregated, and I think that they have maintained more bases overall with a more spread out kind of orientation. And so they have bought down the requirements to do really austere kinds of activities that we talk about during agile combat employment in Southeast Asia or South Asia, so that the requirements are lower, if that makes sense. And so they're working on improving those things, but it's a much easier problem set than we talk about. And the C2 is easier too. When you're talking about more fixed infrastructure, and when you're flying, you're within your own country.
Yep.
So all of the conversation about the Chinese executing ACE, I don't say all of it, but the vast majority of conversation and exercise and everything is within their own country, and even how they would expect to employ it would still be within their own country. And so there's a lot of logistics support in particular, but also communications redundancy that is laid in, that they don't even have to, they don't have to deal with the same problems that we do when we're trying to project power to respond to their aggression into the Indo-PACOM AOR.
Is the Chinese military a professional military? Does it have an NCO corps, and has it modeled itself after our model in that application?
No, it's they function the way that many or most other countries do, and they don't. They do not value the NCO Corps and don't enable the NCO Corps the way that you really need in a modern military, and that and really the best practices that we've displayed over decades. And I think that there is a structural problem with the way that units are organized in China, where you have a dual command system with a squadron commander, for example, or group commander, and a political officer, a political commissar, as a dual command system, and having a commander that's responsible for operations and a political officer that handles many of the other elements. It is while most of the officers are members of the Chinese Communist Party, and that gives you additional kind of both cachet and in some ways more formal roles in an organization, regardless of rank. The much smaller portion of the enlisted corps are members of the Chinese Communist Party, and as a result, they are it just continues to reduce that role. But they recognize the importance, and they've talked about how it is a known problem that they do not enable their NCO Corps, both training and development, and then actually enabling them in the formation. So they recognize it, but it doesn't mean that the steps that they've taken have been serious ones in order to correct the problem.
So that pivots me again to another great question. When we start to talk about agile combat employment in the proactive and reactive scheme maneuver, proactive side, there's some kind of political trigger or some kind of messaging that's telling us, okay, we need to disperse well ahead of the attack. Mm-hmm. And then the reactive scheme maneuver, you can still maneuver while being attacked, right? But the enabler, the key enabler of command and control is mission command with the delegated authorities therein. And so when you are at your contingency location, you have the appropriate delegated authorities to be able to accomplish whatever mission you're required to do at that location, whether that be through a 5-paragraph order, op order type thing, or a multi-day ATO, whatever the methodology ends up being in application. The question is, with that architecture of a squadron commander and a political officer, when they're disconnected from any kind of C2, do you foresee, your opinion, do you foresee issues in their ability to operate in a disconnected environment should lines of communication and or C2 be challenged on their end?
I do. I really see that as a potential problem, because it goes back to the lack of operational experience. So you may have a wartime structure where you have streamlined some of the command authorities, but in some ways the nature of the modern battlefield, modern warfare, is to move more quickly and potentially move so quickly that they are, and to be somewhat vague in the transition between peacetime and wartime, right? We're in that gray area more often and for longer, that it creates the opportunity, I think, to not paralyze an organization, but to disrupt kind of a most efficient and effective flow of information and direction coming from those organizations. And I think that's a real risk that they run. But they've also, again, they've recognized this as a problem. And I see two pathways where they are, that they're pursuing in parallel, pushing down authorities to the lower level. But because of having culture and structures of that were more centralized and having less authority for subordinate units and subordinate leaders, they, devolving authorities to what we would consider the wing level or the brigade level is in their system. That's still not getting the job done for distributed operations that we would envision for ourselves. And so it is. I think that's going to be a real struggle for them. The other idea is to use technology to enable those things. And so trying to use, they talk about intelligentization, using artificial intelligence to streamline processes, but basically to enable C2, and I think as a way to skip echelons in the process. So instead of enabling devolving authorities, making it easier for higher level authorities to direct more operations at the tactical level through algorithms and new technologies that have been developed. And so it's a sneaky way to achieve the same effects that they want, to have as much control as possible, and potentially as much situational awareness as possible, while still not empowering subordinate leaders. And I think that there's a right balance there that it can be struck, and that obviously we're looking at AI and new technologies as well, and in the C2 space at the same time. But the having that balance of being able to use the technologies to enable airmen on the ground rather than trying to skip other echelons of command is something that at the end of the day, I think we're going to do it better because we do it better, enabling our tactical level leaders, both culturally and structurally and everything else.
Interesting. So one of the initiatives that Agile Cabinet Employment has developed is the concept of multi-capable airmen, not necessarily doing more with less, but specified career fields being empowered to do specified tasks. Is it your understanding that they don't have the same kind of trust and empowerment of their people, of their lower ranking airmen or equivalent, that we do, right? We empower our tactical leaders, we empower our young airmen, our senior NCO Corps to accomplish the mission. So from your perspective, everything is top-down driven. Is that a correct analysis of that then?
So I think that I don't know, when we think about multi-capable airmen, I look at multi-capable airmen, not as do more with less, but do a lot more with what you have. And it is because it is a direct kind of challenge to the task organization that we've had in the past, but also you are by a factor multiplying the amount of logistics output and kind of support output that is required to enable the same number of operations. And so but from that standpoint, we have the best trained airmen, the best trained military personnel in the world. And so the empowerment, and it starts with investment in training and respecting and recognizing the critical role, so that you do your primary job better, and are better integrated into the systems. And then we're going to trust and invest in additional skill sets for airmen and Guardians across the Joint Force, in order to execute those. And so I think that from one perspective, I would expect that a Chinese formation, they're at the individual airman level, the individual building block of a military member. They're not going to be, enabled with technology at the local level. They're not going to be invested in the same level of training, and they recognize that, and they're pursuing it. But it's not going to happen, probably in my lifetime. But it's something but potentially their system offers some flexibility where the idea of one, you need to get things done, and because we have the organization we do, the U.S. military is still a bureaucracy, that we have what it says on the unit manning document, and that's what we train to, and that's what we prepare for, along with the other pieces of guidance. But it's something that sometimes we feel hamstrung by our own level of preparation. We were so organized in trying to set up a particular force and task organization that it can be difficult for us to, culturally and organizationally, to get beyond that. To allow people to have the training to, and allow an airman. We're so focused on compliance with an AFI for a material management, a supply NCO, that all of their focus is on compliance and less in their daily garrison tasks. That one, innovation can take a hit, can be a risk to your ability to deliver what your boss is expecting. And then the expansion of additional skill sets in order to be more of a multi-capable airman. All of those things, there are some tensions that we still find, that I see within our own force. So the Chinese system, if you have more of a top-down process where your boss tells you to go do, then the quality is going to be lower, potentially, with people who are not as well trained in any tasks or any jobs that compared with our airmen, but potentially may be able to execute it. And the other element that is not well understood, I think, across our forces, that if the conflicts that we see as potential in the Indo-PACOM AOR involving China they're a home game for China. And so the idea of the Chinese leveraging not just the military logistics structure, but the defense industrial base that, with the emergency powers of the government, whether it's a state-owned enterprise in China or even a private business in China, instead of needing for us to use contracting and show up with a bag of money and say, I want these goods, these services delivered to a remote place, the leadership and the local officials from those suppliers, from those vendors, are going to show up and ask them what they want because of the emergency powers of the government. And it's that kind of national defense mobilization in China, and military civil fusion, where they're leveraging those those goods and services. And so it means that some of what we would be delivering by airmen primarily, and multi-capable airmen trying to do more functions, there are potentially, if we're executing operations, and the Chinese military is operating from Chinese territory, it reduces the amount of requirements and increases the number of organizations that are delivering that. So it ends up seeming more like the expeditionary process, more like we've seen in the support enterprise and the CENTCOM AOR over the last 20 years for our operations, where a lot of those contracts and a lot of that support was already laid in before we landed with our aircraft.
Thank you so much for your information and your time today.
That's going to do it for today's episode of the Deciphering Doctrine podcast. This podcast is produced by the LeMay Center, mixed by Air University Public Affairs. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.